We're very lucky to have as our featured speaker Dr. Anjan Chakravarty. He grew up in Canada. He has his bachelor's in biophysics and a master's in philosophy from the University of Toronto, and then from the University of Cambridge. He has a master's in philosophy from that, as well as a PhD. More recently, a grant was made to the University of Miami for a chair, and a chair in university parlance means an endowed position for which there are specific funds, usually for a kind of specific purpose, a chair for the study of atheism, humanism, and secular ethics. So we're very, very pleased to have him speak to us. He's very thoughtful, and I believe you're going to enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Carrie. I've talked about how ethical and social values play some fairly central roles in scientific practice, from thinking about what directions our science should take to thinking about the methods we use to investigate the things we've chosen to investigate. Let me conclude with one last way in which values are important to science, which has to do with how our values can shape the kinds of assumptions that we bring to scientific work, which in turn ends up shaping what we come to believe. As we've just seen, often interpreting the data of scientific inquiry isn't exactly simple, right? Often it's extremely complicated, and there are lots of complexities that need to be sorted out. Sorting out these things and figuring out what to believe based on our evidence is inevitably informed by all sorts of background assumptions or presuppositions that we bring to the table. Let me give you one last example, which illustrates this idea of how our values can play a central role in even our best science. This example I'm borrowing from my colleague Helen Longino. And again, if you're interested to read more, I've given you the reference to the relevant chapter of her book on your handout. This case focuses on some work in the field of early hominid evolution, the study of how hominids, which are the primates that fall into the same category as humans, like our more recent ancestors and a few other contemporary groups like bonobos, and chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, how they've evolved to become the sorts of creatures they are today. And more specifically, this case is about paleoanthropology. That's the study of fossilized human beings. So the earliest of these creatures lived on African savannas at least 3.5 million years ago. They were about the size of modern day chimpanzees. They had slightly larger brains and they walked upright. How do we know these things? Well, through a study of the fossil record. For example, through things that we can learn about their anatomy, right? Through the fossil record. If you can see how the bones are situated with respect to one another, that allows you to work out things like their gait. Do they walk on all fours, or are they more bipedal? A large part of paleoanthropology is concerned with describing the life and the behavior of these early humans, right? In particular, 3 key developments in the evolution of our species really cry out for explanation. So I've listed these on your handout. The first is a shift from walking on all fours to walking on 2 legs, that is becoming bipedal. The second is the development over time of an increased cranial capacity, so having larger brains. And the third is making and using stone tools. Right? So the question is, how do we explain these things, these changes? What evolutionary pressures led to them? One idea, which was the focus of a research program in the 1960s, was that hunting was the driving force behind human evolution. So if males hunted and females raised young, this would lead to the establishment of some home bases. And here females and young would have a place to wait safely as the hunts became longer and more complex. So no, the theorizing here was based on a sex-based division of labor that would permeate all aspects of life. So for example, education. Training male children would involve teaching them how to scan and track and stalk and pursue. And from this, we get an explanation of bipedalism. Right? There's a selective pressure to free the hands for tool use in hunting, right? To walk on 2 limbs if you're going to use weapons to kill your prey. There is an explanation of how we came to have larger brains. The demands of hunting exert selective pressures for the development of, say, better communication, especially where big game is concerned, because it's quite dangerous. So greater mental development, greater intelligence, larger cranial capacity. We might explain the use of tools, right, in terms of hunting and butchering animals. Some of the, if you've ever seen a National Geographic special on this, right, a lot of the tools are symmetrical. They're called bifaces, right? They've been chipped from stone so that they're symmetrical, which might suggest that they're used in weapons that you might throw. They're symmetrical so that they're aerodynamically, right, predictable. There are other things that you might explain. Our canine teeth, right, have decreased in size over time. Right? Well, there might not need to be so much selective pressure, right, on having large canines if it turns out that, you know, threatening displays to predators can now be expressed, communicated through the use of weapons, as opposed to, you know, showing your teeth. About a decade later, a number of others started saying, wait a minute, there's something odd about all of this. And in order to expose what they suspected as hidden biases in the production of what was then the standard theory, man the hunter, some paleoanthropologists developed an alternative theory that they called woman the gatherer. The goal was really to show how hidden values may have shaped scientific theorizing in such a way as to produce man the hunter. So woman the gatherer begins by accepting the division of labor that was posited by man the hunter. Males hunt, females gather. But rather than focusing on the roles of males in bringing about all of the significant changes, right, that led to the development of our species, woman the gatherer focuses its attention on the role played by females. In other words, they targeted the central thesis of man the hunter, that hunting is the driving force behind hominid evolution. Woman the gatherer suggested that hunting actually came significantly later in human development. In fact, it wouldn't have even been possible if it weren't for the sort of technological and social base that's provided for by gathering. So consider a few things, right? We don't actually need to hunt per se, you know, certainly not big game, to obtain sufficient protein for nutrition. Insects like termites, which I understand are quite nice in a stir fry, invertebrates, small animals, these are all easily caught and very nutritious. And this theorizing was supported by studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. Consider bipedalism. If you're gathering and carrying food, that gives rise to a selective pressure for bipedal movement so that your hands can be free. Larger brains, right? There may have been selective pressure for greater mental development, but not for hunting, but rather for more sophisticated methods of gathering, right? Cooperation, division of labor, right? Greater social organization. Tools may have been used primarily for cracking open nuts and fruit, for cutting things, for pounding roots. And if you think about it, mothers with dependent offspring would have faced the most severe adaptive pressure. So females would have faced the greatest need to innovate with tools to minimize their time and energy expenditure. So for example, to construct slings to carry infants, thus freeing their hands for things like gathering. Or, you know, as a last example, consider the reduction of male canine sizes. Males with smaller canines are less prone to aggression, and as a result, they're less danger to one's offspring. So they might fare better in sexual selection by female. So note, woman the gatherer did exactly the same thing that man the hunter did. That is, they identified the role played by a particular group as the driving force behind the recent evolution of humans. When woman the gatherer was proposed and developed in the 1970s, my understanding is that it was something of a shock to the scientific community. Right? Some people attempted to argue for their favorite model, whether it was man the hunter or woman the gatherer, by citing the relevant evidence. But many of them thought that on reflection, both models actually account for the data quite well, right? And that perhaps it wasn't just males or just females that were the driving force behind the events that led to the evolution of us. The conclusion that Longino draws from all of this is the following. The way in which data and evidence are joined to our hypotheses and theories, and here I quote her, she says, "It floats on a sea of assumptions." End quote. Our assumptions are often laden with our interests and, yes, our values, right? So perhaps it seemed obvious at one time to those whose opinions mattered that only the contributions of males could be important to human history. But that assumption exemplifies a value, an androcentric bias that needed to be exposed in order for our science to become better. This serves as a nice reminder, I think, and also the last of my examples, of why it's important to reflect on our values because they have an enormous impact, not only in all of the places that you would expect them to, but also in places where you might not have imagined that they'd be so important, like in our best science.
So we have a question from Peter.
What is the difference between belief and a fact?
Sure, yeah. So fact in particular is kind of a term of art. People use the term in different ways, but the way that I would normally use it and the way I think it's used in a lot of discussions here is that a fact is a true description of something. If I say that there are 50 people in this Zoom meeting right now, right, there's a fact of the matter about that. There either are 50 people in the Zoom meeting or there aren't. It might be 51, in which case I'm close, but no cigar. Right? But there's a state of affairs in the world that determines whether that description is true or false. And if it's true, right, it's describing a fact. So facts correspond to true descriptions or true statements. There are states of affairs in the world that make our descriptions either true or false. So that's what a fact is, right? You could think of it as a state of affairs in the world, or you could think of it as a description of something like a state of affairs in the world that's true. A belief, on the other hand, is not so much a term of art. I think we all understand it in the same way, right? It's whatever we're willing to endorse as being true. That's what we believe. But there's sometimes a disconnect between facts and beliefs because we know that often we believe things that are false. We believe things that turn out to be false. We might take our best guess about something and believe it on that basis. Whether it describes a fact or not depends on whether it turns out to be true. And this is extremely important, obviously, in the sciences, because in the sciences, it's not a matter of mere guesswork. It's a matter of developing and uncovering as much good evidence you can and reasoning on the basis of that evidence to your best theorizing about what's true. But we make mistakes in the sciences as well, and the historical progressions of the sciences have shown us that things that we once believed turned out not to be factual after all. Thank you for joining in tonight.